I felt ready to live it all again, too, as if that blind rage had washed me clean, rid me of hope. For the first time in that night alive with signs and stars, I opened myself to the gentle indifference of the world. Finding it so much like myself, so like a brother, really, I felt that I had been happy and that I was happy again. For everything to be consummated, for me to feel less alone, I had only to wish that there be a large crowd of spectators the day of my execution, and that they greet me with cries of hate. Hello. That's the end portion of Albert Camus' book, The Stranger, which is what we're going to be talking about today. The Stranger, or sometimes the title has been translated as The Outsider, in French, L'étranger. It's a difficult book to understand if you don't know Camus' philosophy. Camus was the primary thinker of a philosophy called Absurdism, which is a fellow traveler to existentialism, the great sort of post-war French philosophy of people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Camus is in a similar vein, but whereas existentialism tends to be a little more bleak, absurdism tends to be a little more fun-loving. If you can imagine a fun-loving philosophy built on the idea that the universe is fundamentally indifferent to human existence and the search for meaning. But for Camus, this is the thing. He's like, when you embrace the idea that the universe is fundamentally without meaning and that the search for meaning is an absurd quest on the part of human beings, that liberates you. You get a kind of existential freedom. You can create your own meaning in that universe, rather than being constrained by a fake meaning, by a false meaning, a false narrative of existence. And so that's really, really important to understanding The Stranger. So the basic plot line of The Stranger is actually pretty simple. We follow a guy named Marcel Merceau. I actually don't know where the first name Marcel comes from, but I believe that is considered to be his first name, even though I think we only ever get the last name Merceau in the book. So Merceau is a pieds noirs, which is a French person born in colonial Algeria. So he is an Algerian, but he's not an ethnic Algerian. He's ethnically French. We start, actually, the famous opening line, or opening paragraph even, it is also really kind of worth reading. Maman died today, or yesterday maybe, I don't know. I got a telegram from home. Mother deceased, funeral tomorrow, faithfully yours. That doesn't mean anything. Maybe it was yesterday. So we get right from the very beginning this idea that this is not a narrator who is emotionally invested in things. In fact, the book, for being a book written in first person, has remarkably little information about how Marceau feels about anything. He does sometimes talk about being annoyed. He sometimes talks about being bored. But most of the description is what he did or what he saw, rather than what he felt. So it is very unusual, and it's distanced in an interesting way, because Merceau does not really have strong emotional connections to anyone in the book. So his mother has died. He has to go to her funeral. He's not super concerned about that. then he, I can't find the bit I was gonna talk about. So then he comes back to Algiers. He starts a love affair with a woman named Marie, who he had known before when she had worked in the same office that he worked at. He becomes friends with this guy in his building named Raymond. Raymond sort of gets Meursault involved in some trouble because Raymond is this sort of gigolo figure, maybe. He has a bad reputation, but it's not entirely clear what exactly he does or doesn't do and what if it's just rumor. But Raymond is having a confrontation with his former girlfriend, who he believes cheated on him. And more significantly for Meursault, Raymond is having a conflict with that girl's brother. The brother doesn't get a name. He's just referred to in the book as the Arab. We're going to talk more about that. Bear that in mind. The Arab is this sort of menacing figure who kind of follows them around when Meursault and Marie are with Raymond. Meursault, Marie, and Raymond go to Raymond's friend's house on the beach. They go down to the beach. They're doing his beach stuff. They spend a lot of time on beaches in this novel. Then Raymond, the friend, and Meursault have a confrontation with the Arab and one of his friends. Raymond gets his arm slashed open and his face cut because the Arab draws a knife. Meursault one of the big repeated elements of this is that the sun is very oppressive to Meursault. The sun is central to this novel, and we're going to talk a lot about the sun. Meursault is sort of suffering possibly sunstroke, maybe heat stroke, something like that. So he decides, rather than going back up the stairs to the house, he's going to go back along this beach. He finds the Arab again after this conflict, and he ends up shooting the Arab and then shoots him 4 more times. The second portion of the novel, Meursault is in prison, and most of it is spent on him reflecting about life in prison and the kinds of things that he does to pass the time. There's also some discussion of the people that he meets, but not that much. Like, he initially meets with the magistrate, and there's this very odd scene where the magistrate is just like holding this cross over Meursault's head and like berating him to accept God. And I think I marked this passage. Yeah. So it says here, I was about to tell him he was wrong to dwell on it, because it really didn't matter. But he cut me off and urged me one last time, drawing himself up to his full height and asking me if I believed in God. I said no. He sat down indignantly. He said it was impossible. All men believed in God, even those who turned their backs on him. That was his belief, and if he were ever to doubt it, his life would become meaningless. Do you want my life to be meaningless? He shouted. As far as I could see, it didn't have anything to do with me, and I told him so. Well, I love that passage. There's actually a little bit more that I want to read to you from this section, but I love that idea because that's so fundamentally absurdist or existentialist. This idea that we invest meaning in things that are in themselves not meaningful. And then our existence, the purpose of our lives gets caught up in that need for that meaning to be correct. So this guy demands that Meursault validate his belief because it is his belief, and he derives meaning from it. So he goes on. But from across the table he had already thrust the crucifix in my face, and he was screaming irrationally. I am a Christian. I ask him to forgive you your sins. How can you not believe that he suffered for you? I was struck by how sincere he seemed, but I'd had enough. He was getting hotter and hotter. As always, whenever I want to get rid of someone I'm not really listening to, I made it appear as if I agreed. To my surprise, he acted triumphant. You see, he said, you do believe, don't you? And you're going to place your trust in him, aren't you? Obviously, I again said no. He fell back in his chair. I love that last bit. Obviously, I again said no. I don't know. I like it a lot. But yeah, so we get these things where like and then we get the discussion of the trial as well. Much of the trial revolves around the fact that Meursault doesn't really show much emotion when he's at the wake or the funeral for his mother. And the prosecutor is basically like, hey, somebody who doesn't show any emotion when they're burying their mother, clearly that person is capable of murdering anybody for no reason. So the trial goes along. Meursault doesn't follow all of it. He's not that interested in all of it. He does repeatedly say it felt like the trial was being conducted without me involved. And then ultimately he's found guilty, and he finds this kind of freedom. If we think back to the passage that I had started with at the beginning, when he comes to terms with the fact that he is going to be executed, he has this kind of realization that that's freedom. He's now free because he has come to terms with the fact that his existence is fundamentally without meaning or purpose, and things just happen. And because he has accepted that, he can find this existential liberation. So there's a couple of other things I do want to talk about here, mainly in the context of this as a post-colonial novel. Or rather, not this as a post-colonial novel, but in the context of this as a novel from a colonial author. So I'm doing I'll make this a little bit clearer. I'm doing a post-colonial reading of this. This is not itself a post-colonial novel. Camus' actual relationship to colonialism was a somewhat complicated one. As I said, he was a pied noir. Actually, I don't know if I said that. Meursault is a pied noir, as is Camus himself. He is Algerian. He's French, born in Algeria, raised in Algeria. And a lot of his novels are set in Algeria among the French community in colonial Algeria. Camus, during the Algerian War for Independence, which started in 1954, about 12 years after this novel was published, though there had been uprisings against French colonial rule before that, Camus took a sort of ambivalent position. He believed that Algeria should remain part of the French Empire, but that it should have greater autonomy. And he actually worked to get Algerian prisoners released from French prisons. So there was a degree of support for Algeria as such, but he was fundamentally a colonialist. So there's two big elements here. One is that the Arabs, we have the Arab, the brother of Raymond's former lover, but then we also have the Arabs, his sort of smallish friend group who sometimes appears with him, and then Raymond's former lover, none of whom get names. So this is one element of it, that post-colonial scholars have pointed out, the Arab figures, the Arab characters in this book are very much almost part of the landscape. Like they don't do that much. Like they do move, they do walk and stuff, but they seem almost like elements of the natural world, more in the way that things like the sand, the ocean, the sun get treated in the book, more than they do like human beings, human characters. So there's that element of it. That's definitely one critique that post-colonialists have of this novel, is that it does, while it has Arab characters, it largely erases the experience of indigenous Algerians, Arab Algerians. But the other element of this that I think is really interesting is the role of the sun. Because the sun, I think, stands for Algeria itself within the novel, and the troubled relationship that the French have with Algeria. We get a couple of different instances of this, several different places where Meursault seems to get sunstroke or heat stroke or something like this, and really suffers from the sun. And when he shoots the Arab, this is very, very apparent. So I want to read you this whole bit. Sorry. So this is from the end of part 1 of the novel where he commits the murder. It's a bit long, but it's interesting. It occurred to me that all I had to do was turn around, and that would be the end of it. But the whole beach, throbbing in the sun, was pressing on my back. I took a few steps toward the spring. The Arab didn't move. Besides, he was still pretty far away. Maybe it was the shadows on his face, but it looked like he was laughing. I waited. The sun was starting to burn my cheeks, and I could feel drops of sweat gathering in my eyebrows. The sun was the same as it had been the day I'd buried Maman, and like then my forehead especially was hurting me, all the veins in it throbbing under the skin. It was this burning which I couldn't stand anymore, that made me move forward. I knew that it was stupid, that I wouldn't get the sun off me by stepping forward, but I took a step, one step forward. And this time, without getting up, the Arab drew his knife and held it up to me in the sun. The light shot off the steel, and it was like a long, flashing blade cutting at my forehead. At the same instant, the sweat in my eyebrows dripped down over my eyelids all at once and covered them in a warm, thick film. My eyes were blinded behind the curtain of tears and salt. All I could feel were the crystals of sunlight crashing on my forehead, and indistinctly, the dazzling spear flying up from the knife in front of me. The scorching blade slashed at my eyelashes and stabbed at my stinging eyes. That's when everything began to reel. The sea carried up a thick, fiery breath. It seemed to me as if the sky split open from one end to the other to rain down fire. My whole being tensed, and I squeezed my hand around the revolver. The trigger gave. I felt the smooth underside of the butt, and there, in that noise, sharp and deafening at the same time, is where it all started. I shook off the sweat and sun. I knew that I had shattered the harmony of the day, the exceptional silence of a beach where I'd been happy. Then I fired 4 more times at the motionless body where the bullets lodged without leaving a trace, and it was like knocking 4 quick times on the door of unhappiness. So what we get here is the sun as this compelling force that drives Meursault to commit this murder that there's no good reason for him to commit, and he doesn't even really want to commit. But what's really interesting to me about the sun element here, is that in other portions of the novel, the sun is comforting. There's a lot of time spent on the beach and in the ocean, sunbathing with Marie or with Raymond or whatever it is, in which Meursault is really enjoying the sun, but there's also these moments. The murder of the Arab is the big one, but also when he is walking behind the hearse to bury his mother, where the sun is just brutal. And I think that's a really interesting metaphor for the French relationship to Algeria. Because on the one hand, you have this colony where things are generally quite good for the French. It's colonialism, right? So the French are the primary beneficiaries of the colonial relationship with Algeria. But at the same time, because this is a colonial system, the French are occupiers of someone else's country. They're also going to be continually aware that the Arabs pose some kind of threat. There is a continual threat of rebellion or revolution to throw off French colonialism. And so I think you have this kind of tension displaced from the Arabs as a group who might legitimately demand national independence to this physical element, the sun, which is so centrally associated with a desert country like Algeria.